Unless a grain of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it'll never be anything but a grain of wheat. And I think of that reading, I think about all of the people who have things that were handed down by their grandparents and things that they just treasure and put up on a shelf somewhere. Imagine in the Great Depression, the people that came from old country, and maybe they had a farm there and they left everything they had behind, and the only thing they had to bring with them was maybe a few grains of wheat from the old farm that they grew up on, and maybe they have it in a jar up on the mantle as a reminder of the old country. Well, when the Great Depression hit, there was nothing to eat. How many people could have taken those grains and planted them in the ground, watered them, and had them grow up into stalks of wheat, and then those wheat would produce more wheat and more wheat and more wheat? But if someone was holding on to those as this is Grandpap's legacy, then unless those grains were given away and put into the ground, they'd never become anything but a jar sitting on the shelf. And yeah, it's nice to look at in a memory, but what would Grandpap or great-grandpap want more than to know that something from the old farm in the old country fed the family for generations to come? That's the message for the gospel today. St. Maria Goretti was apparently a beautiful young girl. She was only about 11 years old. She had a bunch of brothers and sisters, and she would stay home and cook and clean and wash and do all kinds of stuff, and I think take care of her little sister while the rest of them went out and worked in the fields. When she was 11 years old, she was a very devout Catholic girl. 11 years old, one of the neighbor boys was 18, decided that he wanted to have his way with her. And she wouldn't let him because she would not let that love of God die in her. He stabbed her 11 times, and as she crawled away and reached for the door handle to get inside the door, he stabbed her 3 more times. And at 14 years old, she was a martyr for what she believed in. It's not the way she wanted to live her life. I'm sure she dreamt of growing up and maybe having a family of her own and meeting the man of her dreams, but the dream God had for her, someone else tried to snuff out. But God always, always has a backup plan, no matter what happens. Today was a special day for me. It was my mom's birthday. If she was still alive, she'd be 97 today. And she was one of those people that epitomized that idea of dying to self, that grain of wheat that died that others might live. And everything she did was for me and my sister and for my dad. It was kind of comical to watch how my dad and my mother would work together. My dad worked 2 jobs. He'd come home from one job and about 4 o'clock, and he had to get to the other job about 5, and she'd have everything set up on the table for him, everything he wanted, and he'd sit down at the table and he'd say, I need salt, and I need a fork, and I need a sharp knife, and she'd get out of the way. And she'd set everything up, and he would eat and give her a kiss, and he was out the door. It was like a pit stop. And if you talk about that today, think how sexist that is, that she would be treated like a servant, but not to my mom and not to my dad. They were taking care of one another. And I'm sure my mother had dreams that she would love to have had, but instead of those dreams, she had me, a nightmare. There's the old saying, when you grow up, I hope you have a child just like you. I found a loophole. But it's from our mothers that we learn oftentimes the real meaning of this, that dying to self that others might live, because they do so much, whether it's getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning to make a Thanksgiving dinner that we breeze through in about 45 minutes and then leave them to do the dishes, or if it's all the diapers they change when we're little. God calls us to live not our plan in our lives, but His plan in our lives. I'll leave you with one other mom story. I used to do a lot of homilies about her. I call them momilies. She had a great gift of listening. And people would call her with all their problems. And I never forget one day someone called her, and I was just little, and they said, my daughter's going to have a baby. And my mother said, congratulations. And she said, but she's not married. And my mother said, congratulations. And she said, but you don't understand. She's not married. And back in the day, that was really considered an awful thing. My mother said, that baby is a gift. Any baby is a gift, no matter how it gets here. You love that child, and that child will make such a difference in your life. You mark my words. And the woman said, really? And she said, really. You mark my words. That baby will be the joy of your life. And she was. We're all called to follow as best we can the plans that God has laid out for us, to die to self that he might live in us. And sometimes we make mistakes and take a path not of his choosing, but God always has that backup plan. And as long as we're always listening and correcting our course, we know that that path that he leads us on will lead to heaven. And our job, our sacred responsibility, like Maria Greddy, is to bring as many people along with us on that path as we can. And if we can do that, we'll truly be that grain of wheat that bore fruit 100, 1,000 times more than that single grain could ever bear.